But joining me now is Sarah Leonard. She's a senior editor at The Nation magazine, and she's the author of a great new article in Al Jazeera, which we're going to be discussing, No Sleep Till World Domination. Sarah, how are you?
I'm good. How are you?
Doing well. Very happy to have you on. This is a really fascinating piece that you wrote, basically contrasting and actually showing the overlaps between Wall Street and Silicon Valley work cultures, and actually really the why we should care about them, frankly. But let's start by focusing on the beginning of your article. You're talking about some new moves that Wall Street banks are putting into place to basically reform or shorten somewhat the work hours that young analysts are putting in. Can you talk about what kind of why they're shortening those work hours? What's going on at these banks? What problems are they responding to?
Sure. So this is a move by some banks, most recently Credit Suisse, to cap the number of hours junior bankers can work. That includes maybe only being allowed to come in one day on the weekend instead of both days on the weekend.
Oh God,
And
don't get too lax here. No, I'm just kidding.
no, I
Right.
know it is oddly a significant cultural disruption in banking.
Right.
And what they're responding to is a lot of bad publicity around things like the death of a 21-year-old banking intern in the UK. He was at Bank of America, and he suffered a seizure, probably due to epilepsy, but probably triggered by having worked until 6 a.m. 3 days in a row. He had essentially worked 72 hours straight.
Mm.
And horrifying though this is, it's not really uncommon. And so this has become a source of bad publicity for banks, whereas interestingly, it used to be a source of good publicity. These were the hardest working people on earth. So now they're trying to sort of counter this by publicizing a reduction in work hours.
Yeah, that's fascinating. And actually, you quote some unnamed bankers saying basically, "Hey, look, if you don't want to work those hours, you should find another line of work." Essentially, so there's
Mm-hmm.
obviously still some real clear vestiges of pride in that type of work culture. Why, though, do you think is our turn in how we think about that work culture? Is that just reflecting the fact that more and more people, frankly, probably have a more accurate assessment of Wall Street in light of Wall Street essentially detonating the world economy in 2008? Like, what is leading to that transformation and perception of Wall Street work culture?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely right. When finance was at its peak in terms of prestige, they could do no wrong in the public perception. So they recruited students from Ivy League schools almost exclusively, or the top tier of finance did, and they worked extraordinarily long hours. And one function this had was to suggest that these were the smartest and hardest working people and therefore should not, for example, be regulated.
Right.
Because who was there who was smarter and harder working than these people who could possibly regulate them? And so with the decline in prestige of the industry, with the economic crash, as people came to see, well, maybe they're not so smart, this sort of system of engendering finance with all this prestige is sort of crumbling. And, I think 10 years ago, they would never have thought of reducing work hours. But now that they can't claim immunity from bad judgment, people are wondering why they think why these people need to be working around the clock. Is their work really so important? Are they really so smart that we need them on the job all of the time? Is it worth the lives of young interns? And the answer increasingly seems to be no. People aren't buying it.
Absolutely. So, and this is and actually, I was reminded when I read this piece of people I know in finance, and just even like this culture of actually bragging about well, I haven't had like a
Yeah.
proper meal in days, or well, hey, I'm working with, I should be in the hospital, but I'm working regardless. This kind of culture of
Right.
bragging about having like no actual life and working through actually serious physical illness. But what's also really great about your piece, though, is you explain, and you're already explaining about why. I mean, sure, nobody likes to hear a story of an intern dying because they're working on PowerPoints till 5 a.m. But there is broader implications of this, and you talk about in the kind of elite ideology of today that there is the premium is placed on this certain very kind of narrow type of intelligence or intellect. And I think Chris Hayes has also kind of mentioned this as well. And there's implications from that, and we're going to move into Silicon Valley as you do later in the conversation. But what is it about this cult of smart and how that shows up in terms of why you should be impervious to regulation and how industries sort of prove themselves theoretically as being indispensable?
Um, yeah, so this is really interesting. I think this is a phenomenon captured actually really, really brilliantly in a book called Liquidated by Karen Ho,
Mm-hmm.
who's an anthropologist who actually worked on Wall Street for 2 years, and her anthropology work. It's a truly fascinating book. Um, but one of the ways that this idea of smartness is perpetuated is by finance firms recruiting students from fancy schools, telling them that, so you went to the best school, you want to do an equally fancy thing after school, but you're not sure what it should be. It's confusing to graduate college. Um, Come work for us at Goldman Sachs. We are the Princeton of work, of the work world.
Mm-hmm.
And so students go. And when these banks have meetings with investors, they bring along students who went to the same schools as the investors. They bring a Harvard guy and a Princeton guy. And so this produces this cycle of banks being supposedly full of the smartest people and continuing to be appealing to the people who make them look smart. They bring the brand of Harvard to Goldman. And so this reinforces, of course, this idea that these people are the smartest, and this benefits the banks by making them seem like they should be immune from regulation. So I've heard a lot of people in finance say, or they were, maybe 5 years ago, a little longer before that, high finance is extremely complicated. If you don't work in it, you can't understand it, which of course means either that there should be no regulation or that the people who are doing the regulating should be drawn from the finance industry. Not a great system for regulation, obviously.
Right.
And so this sort of smartness, this idea of smartness really benefits the industry by making them immune from the sort of checks that should be put on an extremely powerful, extremely wealthy industry.
Absolutely, and we're valorizing something. I mean, there's no cultural argument or political argument that says, "Hey, look, the task of educating a child through incredibly complex, social, emotional, physical develop and educational development is incredibly complicated, and most people couldn't possibly understand it. So we're really just going to have to leave education policy to like teachers." There's no like
Right. This is
equivalent,
definitely,
right?
yeah, this is a very narrow idea of what smartness is, obviously. And you can see it. I mean, this is really this is domination by the finance industry, and within the finance industry by the people at the top. This is domination coded as meritocracy, right?
Mm-hmm.
Like, we are dominating you. We are, unleashing these insane derivatives. We are foreclosing on your house because we know best, because we're smart enough to get up here where we can do it. It's a sort of circular logic. It's a very narrow definition of smartness that serves these companies, obviously.
Right. I wouldn't be foreclosing on your house to begin with if I wasn't already sort of better, completely justified in doing that from the beginning because I'm a superior person. And I mean, but clearly Silicon, and then actually, I think the kind of final piece that's important about this Wall Street component, and also in Silicon Valley, when we get to that this kind of culture of abuse and exhaustion within the culture, and also the kind of closed social networks drawing from specific pools of schools, but also fraternities, different social backgrounds,
Hmm.
that also is, I mean, look, obviously the industry needs to be highly regulated, but even if you're talking in an internal culture, that's going to really disincentivize and clamp down the person saying, hey, these derivatives seem actually pretty reckless.
Certainly, yeah. Um, Kevin Roos just put out an amazing book that is based on a set of interviews over a long period of time with some young bankers who were recruited after the crash. And his question going in is sort of why are people still going to Wall Street after the crash? Um, and it involves some of the ideas we're talking about what's considered smart, what's considered prestigious. But one of the points he makes is these people are so run down that one of them says, I'm just trying to keep from drowning.
Mm.
And, of course, pity Goldman. But these are very young people.
Yeah.
They don't have a lot of authority in the workplaces where they're at. But more importantly, they're really not asking questions because they're exhausted and because they're working so hard and they're exhausted and they pretty much feel terrible all of the time. They are also involved in a sort of elaborate process of justifying to themselves why they're there. And that makes it very hard for them to ask questions. They have to say, actually, banking serves a positive social purpose by distributing resources. Or, these really are the smartest people to handle finance. And of course, there are some bad apples, but basically, this is a very important industry. And because they have to tell themselves these things to justify why they're absolutely killing themselves at these banks, sometimes literally, it does not leave a lot of space for critical thinking.
Right, right. So, okay, so but clearly, and we're seeing this, and as you say at the outset of your article, that Wall Street has obviously taken a brand beating at the very least. Substantively,
Sure.
there's no, there's little to no accountability. There's certainly no criminal accountability. There's very little to no financial accountability. There's a bit of regulatory accountability, but not much. But definitely in terms of, I mean, I remember, in college, like in 2006 or 2007, there was still much more of a, even in a movie, like some guy could, he would work at a hedge fund and then, moonlight helping the environment or something, and that was like a really cool character, and that's all disappeared. And now, and that's partially what Wall Street is responding to. But what you identify in your piece so well is that this cult of smartness, it's not that the debranding of Wall Street has not gotten to that fundamental narrative. It's just migrated out west. And now we have
Yeah.
Silicon Valley. And in honor of you, I should say, by the way, I'm wearing a very Zuckerberg-esque hoodie as I conduct this interview because I want to
Oh,
feel,
that's terrific.
yeah, I want to be obviously creative and connected with my passion while we're talking. And, so in
Code all
Silicon
night.
Valley, and so Silicon Valley now has the reputation. I mean, even The Onion, when Steve Jobs passed away, they did, the joke was, the last person in America who knew what he was doing died. And so there's a lot more cultural currency there. But you're saying that these same habits, both internally to the culture and externally in terms of what Silicon Valley is doing, and we're seeing this with things like the revelations about NSA and mass surveillance and connection between Silicon Valley and the inequality crisis. So there's this broader social implication. But then there's also a similar type of work culture, but in both cases, it's concealed by a very different brand positioning, a very different ideology. Explain that for us.
Yeah. Well, there are similarities and differences, I would say. I mean, the interesting thing about Silicon Valley is instead of everyone walking around like on Wall Street saying, "Oh, I haven't eaten a meal in days. Like I haven't slept in 100 years. I'm charging so hard on this deal. Instead, you have this, it's very sort of amusingly West Coast, like sort of chill aesthetic.
Right.
So you have, famously like the really hip offices where people are like riding scooters around. And the idea, of course, is that coding, which started out with certain countercultural origins, obviously not completely, the internet was more or less invented by the military, but there was a lot of interesting sort of countercultural work done with the internet early on and still is. And so the way that Silicon Valley talks about work is by arguing that people who work long hours are doing it because they love it. Mm. I think it's less common on Wall Street. You would have someone say, I just love making PowerPoints.
Right.
But in Silicon Valley, the idea, of course, is that you love to code. And so this gets used to sort of justify the long work hours. And instead of them being enforced in a really straightforward way, such as, a superior calling you on the weekend and telling you to fix the typeface in a slide, you have policies like unlimited vacation days, which of course people don't take because you have to finish the same amount of work. Mm-hmm. So you have a somewhat more insidious enforcement of this work ethic, but people are also in Silicon Valley working insanely hard. And they've come up with all sorts of ways to valorize this in other ways. So I think a wonderful example is Sheryl Sandberg's so-called feminist manifesto, Lean In, which has been the subject of a lot of discussion. But I think my favorite piece on it was written by Kate Lossy at Dissent magazine, which made the point that Lean In codes itself as a feminist manifesto, so a value. We're all feminists, sort of a progressive value. Mm-hmm. But what it's arguing is that you should work harder. That is the fundamental message of the book, is women can get ahead by working harder. But it's for this other value, it's for feminism. And so there are a lot of ways in the Valley of coding harder work as something sort of progressive.
So it's almost like I know that Zizek, I think of him, that Slovenian guy. He kind of jokes about that he would prefer the boss that says, hey, like, shut the F up and get X, Y, and Z done. You're not my friend. Versus the boss who, you go into the office, he puts your arm, the arm around your shoulder and says, hey, man, like, what's going on? And then at the same time, there's the same kind of drive of production behind it. So I guess that poses different. I mean, and I should say again, reflecting again of people I know, certainly there are people I know in Silicon Valley where it doesn't seem all, made up. They do seem more passionate about a given project. They do seem like they have maybe more opportunity to at least potentially work on something, that isn't like just like a movie review app or something, but something that might actually be very socially useful. But that conversation poses its own challenges because I guess again, we're just not being transparent about the actual work relationship. Is that really what it is? We're just not being clear about what's really happening.
Yeah, I think that's true in that, these are people producing a lot of profit for the people who they work for. Right. And so calling it just pleasure and using that as a way to take up all of their time is not great. But I also think it's worth distinguishing between individual coders or people who are interested in the sorts of technologies that they're working on day to day and their employers. So I think it's great to love what you do. That's terrific. And if a higher percentage of people are happier with the projects they're working on in the Valley than on the street, great. But I think what gets left behind is this sort of everyone's just here doing what they love ethos has contributed to a reputation for the tech industry as being all sort of sunshine and light and good intentions. Famously, Google's slogan is "Don't be evil."
Their old slogan. Haven't seen that for a while.
Oh, well, it was good of them to ditch it, I suppose,
Yeah.
looking untenable. Um,
Right.
the but I think what's interesting is that more that these companies can sort of cultivate an image of good intentions and earnest interest in their subject matter as opposed to a profit motive, um, the less harshly they're looked on by the media and ultimately then by regulators.
Right.
And I think that the industry gets away with quite a lot by on this sort of don't be evil ethos. And so whether or not individuals are happy doing their sorts of projects, I think it's worth looking at the industry more broadly and what justifying work on that happiness basis does for the overall image of an industry that's actually trying to get away with a lot.
That's such a crucial point. This kind of image that these are just these sort of like herbivorous companies made up of nice people on, bouncy balls making nice nifty things. And really Silicon Valley is now at the heart of many. I mean, it's about spying and surveillance and the intelligence apparatus. It's how do we protect privacy and civil liberties in the future. It's certainly deeply connected with the inequality crisis, and then there's all sorts of racial and gender aspects to it. So, so is that and so is it important then flowing out of that we have I think it was Yevgeny Morozov. I feel like he probably said this, but I'm not 100% sure. But he's a safe guy to say he would probably say this. But at any rate, but he was saying when we talk about when we say big pharma, big oil, big finance, or even big government, there is a notion from whatever your ideological perspective. Like when I say big pharma, that probably means that I don't think that there are these lovely companies in New Jersey and Switzerland that are really just trying to help people's health. We know
Mm-hmm.
that there's another agenda. We still talk about Silicon Valley, like you're saying, and we still talk about the tech industry. We don't necessarily put that big in front of it. We don't necessarily think of it, as you say, as this is an industry with interests, with power, with a lot of influence. I mean, is
Mm-hmm.
that like the first part of the job is getting Silicon Valley out of the self-help section and into the econ section?
um, yeah, sure. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I think the tech industry is difficult for people to pin down. I think when you talk about big oil, you generally know exactly what big oil wants.
Right.
They want to drill for oil, and they don't want to be taxed, and they want to influence geopolitics such that they are able to drill in more places. With the tech industry, it's complicated because it's not always clear what the tech industry wants or if they know exactly what they want and how the interests are arranged against each other. So some tech companies might be for, uh, more, privacy regulations are like the big question.
Right.
So some parts of the tech industry benefit more from protections of citizens' privacy than others. And it's unclear how all of this is going to pan out. And I think it's more difficult to look at the tech industry as a block and say, well, here's what they want. That said, it's becoming increasingly clear, certainly some things the tech industry would not want, such as, regulation of how social media companies and apps, for that matter, can use our data to sell us things. That's a very straightforward example. Obviously these companies profit primarily from encouraging us to share information about ourselves and then selling that information. So any regulation on that is going to run counter to the interests of the vast majority of what we would think of as the tech industry. And that's also an example of something we might really want regulated.
I would think
We
so.
are sharing a lot of information about ourselves now, and that's another sort of profit-making activity which is coded as pleasure and not work. Despite the fact that we are making a profit for these companies, we are certainly not compensated for sharing things on Facebook, not with money anyway. And so as that is more and more encouraged, we're going to want to take a closer and closer look at what is being done with that data, whether that data is shared with the government, for example, as it has been, and whether or not we are actually able to do that, whether we're able to get a handle on that sort of regulation, is going to depend in part on how the public perceives the tech industry. And for that reason, I think it's very important to sort of pierce through this very charming image that the industry has cultivated for itself.
Absolutely. And actually, as a final question before we wrap up, I think the other thing that you raised right there that's so important is that in both cases, and this is very much the kind of ideological disposition of the tech industry, and not just the tech industry, but very much at the heart of the tech industry is the notion that in all of these cases, it really is just our individual choice. The response being, if you're concerned about your information, don't use social media, right? If you're concerned about whatever, and just as the corollary is, hey, they work 17 hours a day because they love it. There is a discouragement from looking at context and institutions, and everything comes down to, hey, what do you feel like doing?
Absolutely. And I think in terms of our use of social media, for example, this is really, really insidious. Because, of course, people can say, okay, you don't like what Facebook does with data, stop using Facebook. But Facebook is a giant company. Everybody uses it. It's a way that people find out about events and communicate with their friends. And that fact itself is Facebook's doing, in part, right? Mm-hmm. I mean, Facebook did not become massive and pervade our entire lives by accident. They spent a lot of money to expand, and they were very strategic about it. And of course, we participated as consumers of Facebook. But it is, I think, inaccurate to say that it is now, it's completely our choice to use Facebook. It's sort of our choice. We sort of consent. We're sort of compelled. I think it's a much grayer area than is acknowledged by people who make those sorts of arguments. There's actually a truly wonderful article at the New Inquiry this week called "Of Being Numerous" by Natasha Leonard, who makes an argument about activism and surveillance, saying, we now use things like Twitter and Facebook to further our activism. And of course, we need to use these tools because the people we are activists against use big media tools. But those tools also operate to surveil us. And that's scary. And so we're caught in this sort of bind with the tools that we use. And so because we find ourselves in this situation where these technologies really pervade our everyday lives and our activism, for that matter, I think it should matter to us to be imposing some big regulation on these companies so that if they want to be such a big part of our lives, they have to operate in a way that respects our rights as citizens and as people who should not be default surveilled.
Absolutely. Well, no one is too smart to be heavily regulated. That's a very clear lesson from your piece, and and just from the reality we've been living under. Sarah Leonard, the piece is "No Sleep Till World Domination." It's at Al Jazeera. Definitely recommend everybody read it. We have a link to it on the Majority Report website. Thank you so much for joining me, Sarah.
My pleasure.